This is apropos. Well, his quest to take control of the mineral-rich Arctic island from a NATO ally has deeply shaken the global order. Now, Donald Trump says he's cancelling his planned tariffs for European nations over their stance on Greenland, saying he's agreed the framework of a future deal on Arctic security, following talks with the head of the NATO military alliance, Mark Rutte. The comments, posted on Trump's Truth Social network, come after he'd earlier ruled out using force to seize the island as he addressed world leaders at Davos. Here's our Washington correspondent Fraser Jackson with more on what's known at this very early stage about the deal.
With what Donald Trump said, this was the first U-turn on his Truth Social platform. He said, based upon a very productive meeting that I've had with the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, we have formed the framework of a future deal with respect to Greenland and, in fact, the entire Arctic region. This solution, if consummated, will be a great one for the USA and all NATO nations. Based upon this understanding, I will not be imposing the tariffs that were scheduled to go into effect on February 1st. That was, of course, that 10% tariff on 8 European nations that Donald Trump was lashing out against because of their support of Greenland. He then finished that section by saying additional discussions are being held concerning the Golden Dome as it pertains to Greenland. That, of course, that missile defense system that Donald Trump is going forward with. Well, Trump then spoke briefly to some reporters on his way out of the World Economic Forum in Davos, where he said that this deal gave the US everything it wanted, but he didn't say whether it included ownership of the United States, of Greenland by the United States. He paused a bit by that when asked by my colleague Caitlin Collins from CNN. He instead said it's a long-term deal and it's a little bit complex. Reading between the lines here and judging off what I'm hearing from sources, this ultimately is Donald Trump taking an off-ramp that he has been offered by the Europeans. Now, it is believed that this means that the US will not be owning Greenland, but rather what will be happening is that NATO will agree to beef up security in the Arctic region, including in Greenland, by sending more troops to that part of the world. And it also means that the US will be taking advantage of the deal that it already has with Greenland when it comes to troop movements and personnel numbers in the Arctic region. Now, remember, Sharon, that the US used to have around 18,000 troops in Greenland over the course of the Cold War and numerous bases. Now it has just one base, the Pacific Space Base, which it uses to monitor intercontinental ballistic missiles that would head to the US, continental US, from Russia. Well, it's believed that the numbers of US troops stationed there could now increase as a direct consequence of this deal, which Donald Trump says is still the concept of a deal at the moment, but it is still being worked out.
Fraser Jackson reporting there from Washington. Well, for more, we're joined by economist and social scientist Stephen Durlauf, director of the Stone Center for Research on Wealth Inequality and Mobility at the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy. Thanks so much, Professor, for being with us on the programme this evening. A rapidly moving story, as we say. Donald Trump saying he's lifted the threat that he'd made to impose those 10% tariffs on European nations after reaching what he said was the framework of a deal on Greenland. How much of a relief will this be to European capitals? The message tonight coming from Berlin, for example, don't get your hopes up too soon.
Well, I think that's an appropriate response. Every day there's a new position taken by the United States. And so no tariffs today could be restore tariffs tomorrow. That said, I think that the damage has been done and it's very persistent. And what I mean by that is that the threat of tariffs, in some ways it was crossing the Rubicon. Because what it did was it said, number one, that all of the comprehensive trade agreements that had come to pass with the Europeans after this tariff war, they weren't comprehensive. They were not permanent. They were simply temporary based on the whims of the president. And the second thing is that if you combine this threat with the undermining of NATO and the attacks on the European Union that have gone on by this administration, what you have is the United States basically decoupling itself from Europe and making itself an unreliable partner.
Yeah, because tariffs are not what really is the biggest threat here. Those import duties that Donald Trump has been on and off threatening, this isn't the first time that he's moved back and forth, backtracked with various tariffs that he's been threatening. Or really is the big danger here the strained relationship with what is America's largest trading partner? which side is, loses the most, so to speak, if all of this escalates even further? As we're seeing this evening, it's really too early to say what might happen next.
Well, there's an old saying that nobody wins a tariff war, but more generally, nobody wins a war in which good friends are pushed away. In other words, through thick and thin, the NATO alliance, the alliance between the United States and our European and Canadian partners, has been damaged for an unknown amount of time. So that has many implications. For example, even if the tariffs are rolled back, the willingness of Europeans to buy American goods has been damaged. Think about European governments and which defense contractors they're going to want to use. That's already changed. In other words, the trust that you can have in American defense contractors with respect to replacement parts or upgrades, et cetera, has been damaged by this mercurial and, I will say, disloyal policy. So all of that's going to damage the United States. A second example is the loss of the international community of scholars that are going to be less willing to come to the United States. The brain drain is a real thing. It has redounded to the benefits of the United States immensely, and that's being cut back. And so I could go on and identify what it means to lose trust, to no longer be a credible partner in things. All of that, obviously, I'm speaking as an American and how it affects the United States. But nobody wins from that. In other words, it's cooperation between the United States and Europe and the treatment of each other as trusted allies. Allies, of course, can have contentious disagreements, but through thick and thin, you stay together. And all of that is being lost now.
And we're in the realm of speculation here, but what do you think has actually led Donald Trump to ultimately back down here? Is it because he's been coming under pressure from Europe, or is it because of the reaction to all of this that he's seeing at home in the US? Perhaps a mixture of both.
I think it was the stock market, to be honest with you. In other words, there were very substantial reductions in the net wealth of the United, something like $1.5 trillion were lost on Monday. The administration has shown itself to be very sensitive to declines in stock markets, increases in interest rates, decline in bond prices, et cetera. All of that is suggestive, to me at least, that he was influenced by that. I'm sorry to say, but the administration has evidenced so much hostility towards Europe, the idea of the European Union, the cultural differences between our societies, et cetera, that I don't think that there's any sense in which nothing has been evinced to indicate the sort of deep loyalties that transcend political disagreements are part of this administration, even though that has been the case throughout the post-war period.
And Professor, earlier we saw the European Parliament in Strasbourg put on hold the process for putting in place the trade deal that is agreed between the US and the EU just last July. Will this rowing back, do you think, on tariffs be enough to save that trade deal?
I don't know, because I don't have expertise sufficiently in European politics. What I think is the case, and again, I'm giving a judgment about other countries, is that Europe underestimates its political, its economic power with respect to the United States. And what I mean by that is, if one were to go through the anti-coercion legislation of the European Union, there were very substantial penalties that would have been paid by the United States were they implemented. Now, if you ask me to guess, I think that the European governments, by and large, still are trying to propitiate Trump and are hoping that this will go through. And as a result, I suspect that the European Parliament will approve them. But again, I'm speaking as an outsider and not as a political scientist.
Okay, Professor, we'll leave it there for now. Thanks so much for your time on the programme this evening and talking to us about a story that's moved on rapidly since we were going to speak to you earlier on this evening. So we do appreciate your reactivity there. That is Stephen Durlauf, Director of the Stone Centre for Research on Wealth Inequality at the University of Chicago. Thanks so much.